Okay, we're live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week we are talking about recessions. And some of us watched a video by Ray Dalio. It's like an animated video where he explains kind of his take on how the economy works, how the business cycle works, all of that. So we're going to be watching clips from that, and if everything is working correctly, you people out there on YouTube are going to be able to watch the clips as we watch them. So this is a new thing, so we'll see how it goes. So I want to start by getting people's initial thoughts on what causes recessions and how we'll think about recessions and what recessions look like in a world with basic income. Or let me first define what a recession is. So the economy produces a certain amount of stuff, in a given period of time, in a given month, in a given year. A recession is when for a bunch of months in a row, the economy is producing less and less stuff.
I thought it was like 3/4.
There's different definitions of it, but generally speaking, the economy hits a peak and then it kind of comes down and it's going down for a little while. And that down for a little while part is called the recession.
Producing less stuff, okay.
Yep.
Oh,
Yep.
I didn't know that.
And it's generally associated with, unemployment and, maybe problems in financial markets, that kind of stuff.
Catastrophes like earthquakes and
It can be caused by, if there's,
in China, it's caused by the
virus.
Wuhan.
The coronavirus. Yeah. So that can cause a recession. It was very common in the 1800s in the United States for us to have recessions every so often when, it wasn't so good of a growing season or something like that. And that can affect the whole banking system and spread to England, and everything's connected and all of that kind of stuff. So recessions are basically just when the economy is producing a lot and then it goes down for a little while. That's a recession. And then 2008 was the most recent recession that we had here. So Steve, initial thoughts?
Well, I understand that the economy needs credit, and that most credit is good, but then it becomes bad. But nobody knows when it changes from good to bad.
Okay.
Well, I don't really have any thoughts at this moment.
That's fine. Elizabeth?
One of the questions that you asked before you define recession was about like basic income, and that feels like a strongly mitigating factor for recessions. That it's like, okay, the economy is producing less stuff. Like, okay, like that's fine. Like if that's because people don't want stuff, as long as people are able to acquire the stuff that they actually need, like food and housing and stuff, which if people have a basic income, then they have the means to acquire that. And so the sort of like, the economy as a whole is like producing more or less feels less immediately relevant to people because people's income isn't based on what's being produced.
Yeah. Richard?
Well, let's see. Well, the way he explained it was that people's incomes are based on other people buying things, and that they take out credit, so it's like 10% over $100,000 is 110, and then next is 121,000 they can buy if they get all of the 100,000. It keeps going on and on and on. And then the recession is that people they go through austerity, and that decreases the amount of credit in the economy, and that their incomes and go lower and lower, and then
Yeah, so certainly the way he describes it is that there's people who are borrowing, and they're borrowing in order to be able to spend more, and then the people who they spend that money on are able to borrow against the income that they get from the other people's borrowing, and borrowing builds on more and more borrowing, and that's unsustainable and it eventually collapses. So that's kind of like the Ray Dalio perspective. And like we talked about, there can be recessions for a variety of reasons. Like coronavirus might cause China to produce less and have a recession. That is not the kind of thing that Ray Dalio is talking about here. He's talking about recessions caused by borrowing, and then it creates this cycle of booms and busts. So we're getting people's initial thoughts on recessions, and how you feel we should be thinking about recessions, or how it makes sense to think about recessions in the context of basic income. And Elizabeth said that if you have a basic income and the economy is producing less, then maybe that's not even a bad thing. So it could be that we could technically be in a recession and be very prosperous, and people still have money to spend to buy stuff. They're just maybe not buying as much stuff, and that's not necessarily a bad thing or something like that. But yeah, any initial thoughts?
Yeah. So I guess I used to have it, like before knowing you and so on, I feel like I had the same vague sense that everyone has, that for some reason that you get these like booms and busts, and maybe they can be somewhat controlled by government policy with no real sense of what like causes them or how the control works. That was kind of where I was at. That's like basically all I know outside of you, so I guess just kind of out there. But what I found really clarifying about talking to you is two things. One is this idea of interconnected debt obligations and how those become fragile and build up. And so that was a little bit beyond my imagination without somebody like giving me more of a picture for it. I didn't really have the sense of people like borrowing money in order to like place bets themselves, basically.
To what themselves?
Place bets themselves in a way. Like we don't call it placing bets, but like
Borrowing in order to lend to someone
in order
else.
To lend to someone else.
Right.
And then that person.
That's the part I'm not clear about at all.
And then
I don't Richard talked about.
And then that person might be borrowing from that person to lend to someone else who's borrowing from them to lend, so, and sometimes people do these weird things where it's like they do some percentage thing where if they lose like a whole bunch, but if they gain a whole bunch.
So the most straightforward way to think about borrowing in order to lend is to think about just a simple bank. So when you deposit money in a bank, the bank is in a way they're borrowing from you, right? They owe you money. When you come in and want to withdraw, they owe you money. So they're borrowing from you. But then because they have that money that they borrowed from you, now they can make loans so people can buy houses. Like, this is overly simplified, but that's like the basic intuition. The bank is someone who borrows in order to be able to lend money to someone else.
So they can lend your money to other people.
Yeah. I mean, there's more to it than that, but you can like kind of line up how they're funding their loans and stuff like that.
Right. So anyway, so this is important, and it helped me understand better why you would have this collapse, because it's like if somebody can't pay, like with just the bank example, I guess if like people don't pay their mortgages back and you didn't have insurance, like it's 1929, then the bank might not be able to pay you your money back, and so
because they're not getting the money.
Exactly.
And if it's like a whole bunch of layers of this, then the economy is like even more.
Like The Big Short. I mean, it's like The Big Short. Although I never really fully understood that movie, so. But it seemed like there was that chain of connection.
It's a more complicated version of this kind of stuff. Yeah.
So that's one thing I gained from talking to you about it, which I think is pretty mainstream in terms of how people think about why these collapses happen. Probably.
Yes.
And then the other piece that I found really interesting is your idea that you may have already talked about, where why are these like interconnected debt obligations like growing so big, or like. And you point out that we could kind of make it less profitable to be borrowing quite so much in order to lend, and that would help keep these things from becoming so extreme. But we don't do that because of sort of indirect means of getting money to people through borrowing. I thought I didn't explain that well, but you've talked about this a lot in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is that in order for the economy to just function, people need a certain amount of spending power, and if they don't have regular money that they can just spend, what we do is we use economic policy to make it so they can borrow more. And it's not just people borrowing directly, but it's also businesses borrowing in order to be able to hire people. So a lot of times people's wages are funded by debt as well.
But why does it get bigger, as you were saying, Bethany? I mean, why does it develop into something that's bigger than what's needed?
So Ray Dalio has a story about this that's a little bit different from my story, and we'll get to that in the video. For the record, I think he gets a lot of the technical stuff right, but maybe a few of the bigger picture things he's not quite on point on.
Anyway, since
Yeah.
we're just going around, I don't have to go like all into that. But I would
Right.
I was just trying to explain kind of where I started, which was very vague, and like where I am now, which is less vague.
But still vague.
No, I don't think it's that vague. I don't think I'm necessarily explaining it that well, but it doesn't feel that vague to me. I mean, it still has like some vague elements of it,
Sure.
but it's definitely more than it used to be, and I found that helpful. But I think those two parts are also separable, as we'll probably see in the movie. Like you could buy into this idea of the debt obligations collapsing without buying into your story about how basic income would change that.
Right.
So that's also kind of.
So there are two things: the economy doesn't produce enough, and then there's also the debt that grows.
The recession is when the economy is producing less and less. And the debt growing is part of what sustains it producing as much as it's producing now. So when the debt starts to collapse, people can't borrow as much, so they can't spend as much, and the economy isn't going to produce, what people aren't going to spend money on. Right. So that's kind of where the recession comes from in this story. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
But one more deeper thing is like it's just talking to you. It's really stuck with me. This idea of recessions that have nothing to do with anything tangible that affects productive capacity. Like everybody being poorer than they were before simply because of like these financial issues.
Right.
As opposed to like the coronavirus, it's like a real tangible thing that's happening that's like affecting production and transportation. But like the Great Depression, outside of the Dust Bowl at least, a lot of it wasn't necessarily caused by that. It was just caused by like financial markets collapsing. So this idea that we have problems that have nothing to do with tangible production is also a really interesting aspect of a lot of recessions that I found really interesting.
I want to get Nick's initial thoughts first.
Yeah, took up a lot of time, but
I'm kind of interested in the aspects in which it has to do with kind of an instability.
Yeah.
That sort of builds up, and then like some little, like maybe even a tiny thing, or it could be a big thing, then kind of pushes it over the edge into the other.
Yeah.
Cycle.
Yeah. Richard, go ahead.
Well, sometimes perception is more important than facts. Like with right before the 1992 election, there was a story that we were in a recession and that the economy was doing poorly. When after the fact, they did all this investigation into it, and then there wasn't a recession at all. But people perceived that there was a recession, but that there was a recession after, because people perceived there was one, even though there.
Yeah.
So they acted as if there was a recession, and they created the recession.
Right. Because if people think there's going to be a recession, they're going to spend less. They're going to save money, right?
It's the mattress.
And now if everybody's spending less, now the
That's
economy
like
is producing
depression.
less.
That happened with people keeping money in their mattresses.
Right. They might not physically be keeping it in mattresses, but yeah, I mean, it is that kind of thing. And this is kind of what Nick is talking about with the instability, where this instability is building and building, and then all it needs is like a change in people's psychology, and then that can destabilize things. It doesn't have to be, anything big.
That's the magic part of economics that I don't really get, that whole psychology aspect.
I mean, it's not, you're not supposed to get it. It's supposed to be, you're supposed to think of it as like random things that happen that just kind of set something off.
Right.
Like the tinders are there, and this is just kind of like a random spark that comes in.
But then it's like a mob psychology thing that affects it.
Yeah.
Run on the bank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Run on the bank. It's wonderful.
Yeah. And you don't need to understand it. It's just, like.
Good, because I don't.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. What's important is that the instability was building in the first place. I think, right?
Right.
Yeah. Sometimes it's not panic. Sometimes people don't have a choice. Sometimes you owe money and you have to pay it. And if you don't pay it, then you default. And then if you default, the next guy can't pay his debt and he defaults. Like sometimes it's, like even if everybody's as happy and positive as possible, it's unavoidable. Right. So it can be both ways. You guys ready for the first video clip?
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, go ahead.
I think one thing that's interesting to me about that is that we can put a lot of emphasis on that spark like let's say the spark is like somebody acting not very responsibly in the market. Like that's obviously not good, but we might miss the fact that there was like this instability there to begin with. If we were to overly focus on the like immediate cause.
So you blame it on the spark.
Yeah. I think that happens sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like blaming the Great Depression on the stock market crash of 1929, for example. You're focusing on this specific thing that set it off, but really everything was building to that point. Yeah. Okay. You guys ready for the video? See if this works. I don't know if anyone's watching on the live stream, but we're going to try this out.
The economy, transactions. An economy is simply the sum of the transactions that make it up, and a transaction is a very simple thing. You make transactions all the time. Every time you buy something, you create a transaction. Each transaction consists of a buyer exchanging money or credit with a seller for goods, services, or financial assets. Credit spends just like money, so adding together the money spent and the amount of credit spent, you can know the total spending. The total amount of spending drives the economy. If you divide the amount spent by the quantity sold, you get the price. And that's it. That's a transaction. It's the building block of the economic machine. All cycles and all forces in an economy are driven by transactions. So, if we can understand transactions, we can understand the whole economy.
Hold on. Okay, now they can hear you.
The price.
The price.
Where's the price result from? There was an equation I didn't get there, that the something over something equals the price.
The total spending divided by the total quantity of things sold is the price.
So if you think about buying one thing, the amount of money you pay for that one thing is its price.
Right.
So if you think about the total quantity of all things and then the total amount of money that everyone spends, that's kind of like the average price of all things.
Oh.
That's all he's saying, really. Yeah.
But if like you're buying 3 apples with $9, it's the same equation. Like is $3 an apple, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So that's all he's really doing.
Yeah.
He's just saying,
Unless there's in Japan there's really expensive apples, like they're like.
But you could still figure it out the same way.
Yeah.
Spending
But there's different quality.
Yeah.
But there's different kinds of apples.
Yeah. So I mean, conceptually, in terms of how do you measure how much stuff something is, without looking at its price, that's kind of a tricky thing. And there are a lot of people who work on figuring out how to do that, and they come up with market baskets for consumer price indices and stuff like that. And that's how they kind of like calibrate. You don't need to know any of this stuff. This is not important for any of the concepts we're talking about.
Good.
Okay. I'm just explaining to Richard because Richard brought up this point, which is that if you're talking about the price level of a currency, it's anchored to people's judgment about what's valuable to consumers and what kinds of things consumers are buying.
I noticed that
Yeah.
you put stocks in there too, but usually we wouldn't think of the currency purchasing power in terms of stocks. We would keep those out of it.
And you generally don't even put that in a consumer price index. That's exactly right.
So his metric is a bit too broad, I think. Maybe
Yeah. So he brought up a couple things in the video. I've written credit versus money up here at the top. And I wanted to, I guess, quickly mention that he's drawing a distinction. He's saying that the stuff that the government spends or that the government creates directly is what he's calling money. And then anything that's an IOU for government money, or ultimately an IOU for government money, is what he's calling credit.
Does that have to be government money?
Well, I don't understand. So dollars. So government money is like dollars, right?
Right, but credit can be owed by somebody other than the government.
Yes, but what they owe you is government money.
Oh, wow.
They owe you dollars, right?
Right. Okay,
Dollars are
IOU,
government
which
money.
is government
Yeah.
money. Okay, got
Yeah.
it.
So if you have deposits in a bank, for example, those deposits you can spend them at a store using your debit card, and then it's just a transfer of deposits from you to the store. But those deposits, in Ray Dalio's description, those deposits are not money. They are credit. Because like we were saying before, the deposits are IOUs from the bank to you for money. You're not actually withdrawing the money, you're just spending the credit. You're spending the credit as money. So he's drawing that distinction. I would normally say that even government money is a form of credit, because what they're promising is it's an IOU from the economy for a certain amount of stuff backed up by the government. So it's still a form of credit. It's just kind of like the highest form of credit in the hierarchy. But he's drawing a line. So throughout this video, he'll talk about money and credit, and that's where he's drawing the line, basically. So I just wanted to call attention to that.
Because like Aaron really talks more about like a hierarchy as opposed to a specific line.
Right.
I feel like, which is a different subject, but the same idea.
Yes, he talks about a hierarchy, and he even posted a new working paper today where there's a line in there that says something like, we can even think of the government's money as credit. And I was like, yes, that's right. Because one time I was commenting on his blog and I was talking about how everything was credit and whatever, and then he was, saying, no, there's money and then there's credit, but now he's saying everything's credit.
Did he cite you?
He didn't cite me, no. And then the other thing is money stock versus spending.
Money stock?
So money stock is this idea that there is an amount of money that just kind of exists out in the world. So that's called the money stock. It's the stock of money.
I wish it was called something besides stock.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, because stocks. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
money pile. I mean,
You can call it money pile if you want. It's stocks not in the sense of stocks and bonds, but stocks in the sense of stocks and flows.
yeah.
Yeah. Some people call it the money supply. I don't like calling it that because normally in economics, supply refers to flows, whereas this is a stock. So using the term money supply can be confusing. Yeah. So the money stock is the amount of money that there is out there conceptually. And then spending is the total amount of spending in the economy. And as he said in the video, that's really what drives everything, is the spending, is people spending. And they can spend money or they can spend credit. But I wanted to draw that distinction here because there are some points later in the video where it'll be important to point out where his thinking is a little bit different from my thinking. Because you can think of, because he talks about money and credit, but when he's talking about credit, he's still often talking about the kind of money stock equivalent of credit. He's talking about the credit stock, like how much money is there out there, how much credit is there out there. Whereas I would focus mainly on the spending, because there can be a lot of money out there that's not being spent, or a lot of credit out there that's not being spent too, and that doesn't directly influence the economy. Like if Bill Gates is just accumulating a bunch of money, it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect anything, right? Yeah.
Also, like,
Nothing,
I
yeah.
think maybe you just said that and I didn't like that, but if you're also including credit, and Steve would probably agree, it's hard to measure the total amount, because how do you know how much credit is out there that kind of could be spent?
Yeah, what counts as money, what doesn't, what kind of credit is close enough to being money that it would fit into this, like you can't really figure out how much money exists. That's not like a real thing you can figure out. I mean, like there are plenty of people who put a lot of work into like coming up with measures of the money stock and different drawing the line in different places and then telling you what the amount is when you draw the line in different places. And it's an interesting exercise, but it doesn't help us really understand how the economy works. Yeah.
But even in the quantity theory, money has velocity multiplied by it, right? So they're really thinking about spending too.
Conceptually, they're thinking, well, they created so quantity theory of money is the idea that prices in the economy are determined by how much money there is out there, so the money stock. And then some people might expand it a little bit more into some kinds of credit, so that also counts as money or something like that. So what they did was they took the total spending, they took the spending in the economy, and they divided it into these two parts. There's how much money there is, the money stock, and then how fast it's cycling through the economy.
Where do the numbers come from?
What numbers? These are concepts. They're not numbers. Yeah, this is a conceptual framework, and the idea of how fast the money is churning. That's what they call the velocity. And the only reason the concept of money velocity really even exists is as a residual to account for if the money stock hasn't changed according to whatever our concept of it is, then maybe something weird happened with the velocity of money. So it's not really, these two concepts are not useful concepts. So I'm explaining things that aren't useful.
Okay.
So what matters is the total spending. And there are some people who came up with theories about what causes the total spending to be a certain way. Some people say it's based on the amount of money. Some people say it's based on how fast the money is circulating, or a combination of the two. And conceptually, you can kind of see that it's a combination of the two, but you also don't need to break it apart in the first place, is my point. is very hard to do in practice. And depending on where you draw the line and how you conceptualize it, some things could be considered in some cases more money stock, or they could be considered, more velocity of the same money. So for example, if you're limiting the money stock to be very narrow, excluding, like drawing the line where Ray Dalio does and saying like all these forms of credit, they aren't really money. So when people start spending the credit, what that looks like in the statistics is it looks like the money is being spent faster and faster, right? Or you could say we're broadening our definition of money, so now instead of the velocity getting faster and faster, the amount of money is growing. Yeah. It's completely arbitrary.
Whereas spending, you can measure that.
Spending you can measure. Spending is something that's actually happening. People are spending money. I could pay you if you say, I want to sell you this car for $2,000, and I'm like, great, I'll give you 5 cows for that. The price is still $2,000, right? We made a transaction that's worth $2,000, so that would show up as $2,000 worth of spending. The fact that I didn't pay you using money tokens or dollar bills or something like that doesn't matter. I paid you using cows, but there was still $2,000 worth of spending in the economy.
In a way, it's only the velocity that counts. I mean, if you think about Bill Gates again, I mean, that's money stock.
Again, it's not the velocity that counts, because you could have $1 circulating really fast, or you could have $1 million circulating at a millionth of the speed. It's the combination of the two, and it's not the combination of the two, because we only split those two things apart because we wanted to come up with weird quantity theories of money. It's the spending, it's the spending that matters. All right, you guys ready for the next clip? Here we go.
A market consists of all the buyers and all the sellers making transactions for the same thing. For example, there is a wheat market, a car market, a stock market, and markets for millions of things. An economy consists of all of the transactions in all of its markets. If you add up the total spending and the total quantity sold in all of the markets, you have everything you need to know to understand the economy. It's just that simple. People, businesses, banks, and governments all engage in transactions the way I just described, exchanging money and credit for goods, services, and financial assets.
Okay, so that's kind of on the same topic. He's just kind of like giving more examples and fleshing it out a little bit.
I feel like,
Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts? Robert, do you have any thoughts about recessions or anything?
Not at this point, no.
Okay.
Still acclimating to my new...
Yeah. Did you watch the video?
I did not, no.
Okay.
well, we're watching it.
We're watching it now.
Excellent.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think this is, he's basically just showing that the economy is a bunch of these transactions, and they can be categorized into markets and that kind of thing. Yeah. All right. Ready?
The biggest buyer and seller is the government, which consists of two important parts: a central government that collects taxes and spends money, and a central bank, which is different from other buyers and sellers because it controls the amount of money and credit in the economy. It does this by influencing interest rates and printing new money. For these reasons, as we'll see, the central bank is an important player in the flow of credit.
Okay, so important here, notice that he says the amount of money and credit. So he's thinking in terms of the money stock. So even though before he said spending was the most important thing, he's talking about the amount of money out there. And I would say that is probably not how I would describe the important role of the central bank. I wouldn't say it's about the amount of money and credit, but I would say it's about the availability of money and credit, the availability of funding so that spending can happen in the economy. And that...
How would you define availability? I'm not sure what that means.
So the ability to borrow. Yeah.
And the availability of printed money too? Or... So typically these two things are related. So the central bank prints money to buy financial assets from the market, typically government debt, that kind of thing.
And that affects interest rates.
And then that affects interest rates. That affects the amount of credit creation that's happening in the economy. So it's not about the It's not about the amount of credit kind of in the economy or the amount of money in the economy. It's about the rate of growth of these things, or the flow of money and credit that's available to people in the economy. Because if that flow dries up, even if it's the same amount of money out there, then people still aren't going to be able to spend, right? Because all the money ended up with Jeff Bezos. Right. Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts or?
So in this cartoon,
Yeah.
if the government wants to buy something,
Yeah.
on the left,
Yeah. The
they
central government. Yeah.
how do they get the cash to buy like a boat or something?
Yeah. So they're either going to use taxes or they're going to use borrowing. If they borrow, then the central bank can come in and say, oh, we're gonna buy some of that debt. In other words, the central bank is lending to the central government, and that's kind of like the money printing is a two-step process.
I see. The central bank prints it, and then they trade it with the central government for an IOU.
Yes, that's right. And then the central bank just holds on to that IOU, and the government spends the money. They don't directly trade it with the central bank. They sell it on the open market, and the central bank buys it on the open market. But it's ultimately the same thing is happening, the same effect.
Okay.
Yeah, what was I going to say? Something about central. The way Ray Dalio talks about it, he talks about it as if the central bank is deciding to print the money. I would say usually it's the other way around. Usually the government decides to spend, and they'll issue debt, they'll borrow from the market in order to spend, and then the central bank has to follow. They have to kind of accommodate that spending, and they buy up the debt to keep interest rates where they want them, to keep the price level where they want it, that kind of thing. So it's usually not the central bank that's in control. The central bank kind of knows what it has to do and will do whatever it needs to do in response to whatever the government does fiscally.
But what if for a different reason the central bank decides to change the interest rates? Like, would they not then print the money in order to buy up more things in order to change the interest rates potentially?
Yeah. So if they want to tighten monetary policy and raise interest rates, then what they would do is they would actually start selling government bonds onto the market, government debt, and that sucks up, because they're swapping, they're selling. So that means they're selling the treasury debt onto the market, and then they're getting money in exchange. So they're sucking money out of the market as well.
But what if they wanted to lower interest rates? Wouldn't they print money for that?
If they wanted to lower interest rates, yeah, then they'd buy more government debt from the market that's already out there. So the amount of treasury debt, the amount of central government debt that's out on the open market is decided by the central bank or the Federal Reserve, and that's kind of a monetary policy decision. It has nothing to do with what the central government is doing. It has everything to do with how the central bank wants to influence interest rates. Yeah. Yep. Okay. You guys ready?
I want you to pay attention to credit. Credit is the most important part of the economy and probably the least understood. It's the most important part because it's the biggest and most volatile part. Just like buyers and sellers go to the market to make transactions, so do lenders and borrowers. Lenders usually want to make their money into more money, and borrowers usually want to buy something they can't afford, like a house or a car, or they want to invest in something like starting a business. Credit can help both lenders and borrowers get what they want. Borrowers promise to repay the amount they borrow, called principal, plus an additional amount, called interest. When interest rates are high, there is less borrowing because it's expensive. When interest rates are low, borrowing increases because it's cheaper. When borrowers promise to repay and lenders believe them, credit is created. Any two people can agree to create credit out of thin air. That seems simple enough, but credit is tricky because it has different names. As soon as credit is created, it immediately turns into debt. Debt is both an asset to the lender and a liability to the borrower. In the future, when the borrower repays the loan plus interest, the asset and the liability disappear and the transaction is settled. So why is credit so important? Because when a borrower receives credit, he is able to increase his spending. And remember, spending drives the economy. This is because one person's spending is another person's income. Think about it. Every dollar you spend, someone else earns, and every dollar you earn, someone else has spent. So when you spend more, someone else earns more.
Okay. Did everyone follow that? Yeah, Bethany.
Oh, I just like your point that he kind of talks about where like credit creates money in the economy and creates more spending, and like actually paying that back destroys money and kind of destroys spending in a way. It's
Right.
kind of interesting way of thinking about it.
Yep.
And you can see that in his diagram.
Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts about that? Make sure we have. Oh, Mitchell says everything's working,
Oh, great.
and Derek as well. So thanks, guys. Yeah.
I guess I have a probably dumb
Yeah, Rob.
question, but the concept of interest, I guess in a finite money pool, like if there was only $10 in circulation and 5 and 5, if somebody borrows, like I guess where does that interest come from, right? Because you're essentially saying more dollars are coming back than were originally lended, so. On a
Right.
big scale, is that where the 2% inflation comes in, or like where does that extra money come from? That interest money?
Yeah, I would say it's not necessarily where the 2% inflation comes in, but generally speaking, in order to kind of keep that going, people have to borrow more. There has to be more lending somewhere, and that lending can come, or borrowing can come directly from the government, or it can be in the private financial sector. So when the government prints more money or issues more money into circulation, as it were, each of those dollars is kind of an IOU from the government for a certain amount of stuff. And if there's more dollars out there, then it can then people can have find ways to get those extra dollars and then pay back their debts. So in terms of so there is more money being created. Whether that leads to inflation or not, in terms of prices going up, depends on other things in the economy, like how the level of spending relates to the level of production in the economy and all of that kind of stuff, and it gets complicated. But yeah, generally speaking, you can't just have a fixed amount of money kind of in the economy and then have people borrowing and expect them to be able to pay back their debts. If you think about like a primitive economy, then you could have a lot of people kind of owing each other things, and it kind of cancels out a little bit. Like I owe you interest on some cows that I promised you, and you owe me interest on some apples that you promised me, and it's all kind of a wash. Like you can imagine it kind of working out that way.
Right.
In real life, it doesn't just all end up balancing out like that. There's more and more debt accumulating over time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the answer, is more and more debt. It's like a snowball effect, because like it's not a true one-to-one relationship to dollars and then dollars.
Yeah. So it's more and more debt, and then we have a choice as to whether that debt is government debt, like more actual money being printed, or whether that debt is private sector debt.
Okay.
If it's private sector debt, then you get this problem with credit cycles where there gets to be a buildup of kind of interlocking debt obligations that grow more unstable and brittle over time, and eventually collapse, and you get these kinds of recessions and all of that, which is what Dalio is kind of building towards in his exposition about the business cycle. So the business cycle is this idea that the debt builds up and up and up and up, and then it kind of collapses and then starts building up, and you kind of get this repeated pattern.
House of cards.
Yeah. I would say that that's optional. We don't have to do that. If the government prints more money, then borrowing can just kind of stay at this kind of
low but sustainable level where, you know, the financial sector isn't really doing much more than kind of greasing the wheels of investment in real businesses and stuff like that. But, you know, that's not where we are today.
What about spending and earning? I didn't understand that relationship. What you're spending, somebody else earning. What
Yeah.
you're earning, somebody else.
So if I spend $1 million on your business, that's $1 million that you earned.
Right. Okay.
So if I borrowed that $1 million, then that's $1 million that you earned that was ultimately funded by borrowing.
Okay.
Right. If I'm not able to borrow as much, I'm not able to spend as much, and that means the people who I'm spending money on are not able to earn as much, and they're not able to spend as much either.
I'm just thinking about the relationship of work to this model, and then ultimately basic income, I guess.
Yeah.
How that relates to the spending earning equation that you brought up.
Yeah, I think in this model, most of people's incomes are earned, so they're selling something, right? So he's imagining an economy where people are selling something,
Right.
and that's how they get their money.
Mm-hmm.
If you're getting a basic income, you didn't sell anything
Right.
to get that basic income. So none of this process affects the basic income
But
side
I
of
was
things.
thinking
Yeah.
it's actually kind of the same in the sense that right now he's giving his money from this credit, from this promise to pay back. But you
Mhm.
could also imagine he just gets that money from basic income.
Yeah.
And it would be the same like effect where then
Right.
he spends it on something and whoever gets that money has more money.
Right.
And then they might spend that.
But he didn't earn
Right.
it,
But if-
that's
if-
extra.
Yeah.
But you don't have this effect where if borrowing gets to be harder to do, then suddenly you can't.
No, you don't have
Yeah.
the effect of having to pay it back later, so it doesn't really
Right.
have that aspect. But it
Exactly.
does have the aspect of, like you've talked about with even like a relatively small basic income might have a bigger effect than you think, because it doesn't just affect the spending of the first person, it then affects the income of the next person.
Right.
And the next
Yes.
person, and
Right.
so it,
Outside of the
Yeah.
job situation, right?
yeah. And
But
the
it-
credit's doing the same thing.
But I mean, if the question is how does wages and earning fit into this model, it's just another transaction, right? It's like exchanging dollars for services. Like maybe my
Right.
service is I show up and answer the phones at your.
Right,
Front
and the
desk.
dollars
Yeah.
that we usually think of, they're coming from jobs, so
That's-
we're earning them.
That's
and
salary.
spend- Yeah.
Yep.
I
Yeah.
wanted to share that what this was making me think of is, I mean, these cartoons, like representing it this way, it's like, oh, this is all very, like, of course, it's obvious. But I don't know, I was just reading, I mean, like, it's very, it's a fiction in the sense that we're not, like, credit, I'm thinking of credit here. It's like a promise that you're going to do something in the future, pay back this money, and how we construct that has changed a lot over time, right? Like we used to have debtors' prisons. At least,
Yeah.
I was like, at least there's some narratives that, you know, in the Romans like to say, like, if I don't pay you back, you can cut off my finger.
Yeah.
And you know, some like Nietzsche argues that these kinds of promises is like the original origin of our conscience, right? I mean, it's connected to very
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't get
fundamental-
a finger cut off, but people end up being homeless. I mean, there are consequences.
right. We have a whole
The
different
debt- the
setup
different
for right.
punishments.
It relies on some kind of consequence,
Yeah.
one way or another,
Right.
and that consequence has changed over time.
Yeah.
But
And it's further removed too from the actual original one transaction. It's an accumulation of things. People get poor through cumulative incidents and things in their lives, not one thing. It's a number of decisions that might be bad decisions or things that happen to them, calamities or whatever. So it's not like, can be traceable sometimes to one thing.
And I think Nietzsche even argues that it's the origin of the idea of free will, where it's like involved in the origin of the idea of free will. Like if you don't believe that you can choose to pay back the money tomorrow,
Right,
then you can't promise to pay it back tomorrow.
right.
It's a little
I
far-fetched.
think Nietzsche's wrong because there's a lot of earlier social obligations that aren't this before you have money.
I mean,
In
maybe-
small-scale societies, you have
Maybe
money.
he's talking about
Right.
social obligations.
I mean,
in
he's like
general.
sort of
Oh,
telling
yeah.
a fairy tale about
Yeah, yeah.
the origin of conscience, but still,
Right.
it's like it's kind of interesting that like he puts
Yeah.
it on this.
Right, and it is interesting, and I think
Yeah.
what your comment is when you think about it is just that, like, you know, where does the trust come from that you're going to pay it back? You need that to have the credit. Like, for you to give me money, you have to trust that I'm going to pay it back.
Right.
So
Right.
even I have an incentive. Like, that's why a woman might say you can cut off my finger. Like, even I have an incentive to have almost like some kind of punishment down the line, because otherwise you won't trust me, right? And then you won't give me the money. So, you know, we all kind of have some incentive for there to be some reason for people to trust each other. It doesn't have to be as draconian as that. It could be like your social reputation, like no one's going to loan you money, or your credit score, like no one's going to loan you money in the future.
Or it could be a pure fiction,
yeah.
the way you look, the way you present yourself at a bank when
Yeah.
you go in to get a loan, for example.
Right.
People have whole strategies
Different
built
factors.
around
Yeah, exactly.
how to give the illusion that you
Right.
don't really need it that much.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this is the banker's paradox, right? The people who are able to borrow are the ones who already have money.
Right, because they're
Yeah.
the ones who are going to pay it back. Yeah.
Exactly.
But I do think it's an interesting question, like how this problem has been like quote unquote
Yeah.
solved or like dealt with
Mhm.
over the years, and which is a better or worse system for like dealing with that.
Yeah, and there have been, you know, like places and times where it's illegal to charge interest and stuff like that.
Like
So-
in Islamic society.
Well, a lot of places, yeah, in Christian, Catholic societies
and
as
then
well.
how do you get like the economic benefits that they're talking about?
Yeah, how do you get someone to lend to you if you're not promising to pay them for their trouble of giving you the money or compensate them for the risk that they're taking by lending to you? Well, maybe you promise to chop off your hand, right?
But,
Maybe
well,
that's
they
what you
do
do.
it anyway, because you're not getting anything out of it if you're not going to get anything out of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like,
So you
Nietzsche
still
would
need
say
to
it's
do
because you would actually love to chop off their hand.
something.
That
Well,
would
yeah, that's
be
another
amazing.
possibility, I guess. That's another way you could incentivize it.
yeah,
I
yeah.
hope you're not going to pay it
But
back.
it also makes me think that, you know, over time, who in practice is making these judgments about who is worthy of credit is changing.
hmm
And, you know, we're living in a particular moment of that, and soon it's going to be AIs.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly it's been scaling up for a long time, right? Like the reason we have banks is because banks make it a business of figuring out who's creditworthy. So if you have the liabilities of Elizabeth or Nick, if you just have IOUs from them, other people are going to be like, I don't accept this as payment. But if you have liabilities from the bank, then you're like, oh yeah, it's bank money, it's good, and the bank is the one who makes the judgment about the creditworthiness of Elizabeth and
Yeah,
Nick.
so they really helped
Yeah.
us solve this problem of we don't know who's going to pay it back, et cetera, as individuals, right?
Right. The bank figures out who to trust, and all you have to figure out is to trust the bank. And
And the bank is looking to some credit agency, and
Right.
they're now like mining your Facebook feed.
yeah, exactly. So it can get pretty extreme.
But the part that seems, well, just to add on to this, like the part that seems more better to me than chopping off a finger is like, well, let's just see if you paid things back in the past, and we can actually keep track of that. Like there seems like there's an advantage to that system over prison, certainly, or like
There
other-
is, but then people who have bad credit can't borrow.
It doesn't solve that
Right.
problem.
It doesn't solve that problem. So
But prisons don't solve that problem either. That's why none of these things solve
Right.
that problem.
So Jay Gannon on the live stream says, however, only the credit-worthy wealthy get access to the money,
Yeah.
and so can leverage the whole system by buying up all of the assets and rent-seeking. It's called the Cantillon effect. So the Cantillon effect is actually, so he's an economist from before Adam Smith.
Really?
Yeah. So the Cantillon effect is the idea that if you add money to the economy, it affects prices differently depending on where you add the money, right?
You like that idea.
I like that idea.
Where, what location?
Who you give it
Who
to?
gets it?
Who gets the
Who
money?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the quantity theory people would just say, oh, there's some amount of money out there. You just put it in the economy, and then it, kind of spreads out or whatever. The Cantillon idea is that no, that's not really how it works. If you give the money to someone who wants to buy a lot of potatoes, that affects the price of potatoes. If you give the money to someone else who doesn't want potatoes, it doesn't affect the price of potatoes. That kind of thing. But this is also related to the fact that money doesn't just spread itself out evenly in the economy. It doesn't just keep circulating, right? It flows from consumers to producers. You have money flowing in one direction and goods and services flowing in the other direction. So depending on where the money is injected, it's
has to be kind of a continuous thing. Consumers need a source of spending money. So yeah.
I think that's right, and I guess I just wanted to comment even more on what you guys were saying about like who ends up being creditworthy. Like basically, if you don't have money, you're not going to be able to pay back money very easily. So like that problem needs to be solved in some other way besides keeping track of who actually will pay it back, because like maybe you're not in a situation that you can really pay it back. Because you're more fragile as a whole person. So that's where like Alex talks a lot about basic income. Like somehow there's the problem of just not having money to begin with. I guess is what I'm trying to say. And credit doesn't solve that problem.
People who won't go into debt. I mean, as a matter of principle, they don't want to be in debt. And the whole idea of credit really is pretty recent. I mean, buying things on the installment plan was post-World War II. That was a huge thing to do that came into everybody's life.
Consumer credit is.
Yeah.
So I mean, credit and debt have been around forever, right? So there's no, I mean, like it's, I think, to the origin of money, you can probably trace the origin of debt. Like if you read David Graeber, Debt the First 5,000 Years, that kind of thing. So I don't think credit is new, but what is new is that we come up with all kinds of new innovations in how to give people credit, give businesses credit, how to invest, how to help people lend in new innovative ways, financial innovation. And, a lot of that is very much related to regulation too. The more regulations there are, the more opportunities there are to do new things that maybe accomplish some of the same things you were doing before, but don't run afoul of the regulations and that kind of thing. It's called, what is it called? Regulatory innovation or something like that. I don't know.
That seems counterintuitive to me. The more regulations there are,
the more
freedom to.
Yeah, if there were no regulations on the financial sector, you wouldn't need a lot of these innovations, right? Because you could just do whatever you wanted in a straightforward way. Yeah, you could say that. There's not really. It's kind of like with regulating the financial sector. There's an analogy that Perry Marilyn uses, where he's like, he's squeezing on one end of the balloon and then everything pops out the other side, that kind of thing. It's especially hard to regulate when you have a central bank that's trying to make credit easier as well. So the central bank is facilitating all of this process that's happening in the financial sector because they want to keep people borrowing and being able to spend, and they want to keep the currency's purchasing power stable. And they wouldn't have to do any of this stuff if the central government was spending more money. They wouldn't have to grow the financial sector so large, right? So this is kind of where basic income comes in. Because if the central government is paying out a basic income to everyone, that allows the central bank to tighten the financial sector. Yeah. Yep. You guys ready for the next one?
I just have one more thought. Maybe I don't want to pull us off topic, but related to your point about like different ways that we've tried to keep people accountable. It also seems like a paradoxical consequence somewhat of like getting rid of something like jail is that you might have to rely more on something like past history. So like in most extreme cases, let's say like if you don't pay back your money, you're going to get killed. Like, okay, most people maybe are going to do like their absolute best to pay back their money. Maybe they won't always, and it will still matter how rich they are, but like ultimately they're just going to do it the most. Whereas if there's not like a huge consequence, then people who have more costs to try to pay it back are going to be less likely to pay it back to a greater degree. So you might have to rely more on like what you were saying, like do they even need it in the first place? And if the less they need it, the more they're the person who's really going to bother to pay it back, even though the penalty isn't that big if they don't, because it's not that costly for them to do it in the first place. Whereas the person who would have to like, I don't know, rob their family to pay it back, like they'll do it if they're going to get killed, but they're not going to do it if their credit score goes down. And so you actually don't give them the money. Like so paradoxically, with a less hard penalty, you might be more strict about who you give the money to, and it might depend more on the past.
And this is exactly why we see with payday lenders, right? Why do they charge so much interest? Because if they were charging less interest, they wouldn't be giving out the loans. It wouldn't be a part of their business. If they were charging less interest, they would be a regular bank, and people wouldn't be able to get the money, right?
They wouldn't be able to, right?
Right.
Yeah, and that other paradox is they're going there because they're really not well off enough to get it from a bank, so they're paying higher interest.
Yeah, I mean, if you could get a loan from a regular bank, then you're not going to go to the payday lender. Therefore, the payday lender has to raise interest rates even more because the type of borrower they get are less creditworthy, that kind of thing. it's a funny thing because we think of these payday lenders as kind of predatory, and they're like preying on people's weaknesses and needs and stuff like that. You could frame it that way, but if you take the payday lenders away, you're taking away something that people need and rely on. So really, I think the problem is that we have a system where people are relying on these kinds of things, right? I think it's more useful to say, hey, what's wrong with the system? How do we fix it? Than it is to blame necessarily the individual participants in the system for being evil or malicious or something like that.
And I guess one way to talk about that is like credit is not a great way to get people money who don't already have money. Like it doesn't really end up getting them money. Or if it does, it gets to them like very expensive, they have to pay back later.
Yeah, I mean, it depends, right? You can imagine, a situation where someone wants to start a business and they're confident that it's going to be profitable and they can demonstrate, like, hey, we're going to do all this great stuff. We just need a little money to get started. We're going to borrow it and we'll pay you back from our profits, right? Like that sounds very healthy, right? And that kind of thing exists, yeah. And ideally, if we have a properly functioning financial system, that would be what most borrowing is. It would be, hey, I've got a way to make money. You can have a cut of it if you help me fund this project. Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, you guys ready for the next clip?
Yeah. This is a little bit off topic, but it makes me just wonder, like, what would it look like if instead of basic income, you said we're going to have a kind of government-run payday lender that will lend anybody up to, instead of the basic income amount, $2,000 a month, and the interest rate's really low, it's the whatever, and if you can't pay it back, that's okay. We'll just keep lending it to you.
But then like you don't have to pay
Well,
back.
And then
I can tell you what I would do in such a system.
what?
So I would borrow the max amount.
Right. Well, the max amount is like whatever the basic income would be.
Sure, and then I would turn around and I would lend it to the central bank at a higher interest rate.
Meaning you'd buy a government bond.
Sure. Yeah. Why not?
So people would take
The government is lending cheap and they're borrowing at a higher rate. So why don't I just pick up the difference?
Well,
Such a peak Alex answer. Your arbitrage opportunity.
no. So the rate would be the same as you'd make those rates the same, so that wouldn't get you anywhere. But
Okay, well then you wouldn't be able to tighten the financial sector enough because that requires raising interest rates.
So then it'd be expensive to borrow too.
Yeah. I mean, like you could imagine, even just with people's basic income, they could take that money and then lend it out in the financial sector too. So I guess it's similar in that way.
Yeah, but I guess the constraint there is they might actually need to spend it and not just sit around.
Right. If you're just offering borrowing, then people aren't going to borrow unless it's worth it for them to borrow. Like if they already have enough money, they're not going to borrow. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah.
But if they don't have to pay it back,
I'm just trying to think of like whether it helps it, what difference it would make to think of a basic income that
Oh,
way.
I see.
It's like I'm just
Oh, I
lending
see.
you more and more money,
I see.
and you're never paying it back.
Right.
Well, is this different than the zero interest rates that actually exist in some places now?
Right. That keeps zombie companies alive and stuff like that. I think it's similar. Yeah, you can just roll over your funding and get more of it whenever you need it, that kind of thing.
So some companies have that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key difference is that when you think about interest rates, it's not usually that you can borrow, that there's a certain amount of borrowing. It's like there is a price in the market, and I guess you do have a credit limit with whoever you're borrowing from. I don't know if it's useful to think of basic income as a form of lending that you don't pay back.
Probably not.
Because what's the point of thinking?
I guess maybe the only point would be is if you were going to say like, we're not going to expect you to pay this back unless you get really rich, and then
Yeah, that could be a disincentive to like be profitable and stuff though too.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. That would be the
Well,
best.
but it might select out the people who really need to borrow it, and people like Bill Gates won't bother going there
Right.
to the place.
I mean, I think essentially what you're doing is you're creating a roundabout way to
Yeah.
give people money and then tax them when they get rich.
Right.
Yeah. And if that's what you're doing, you can just call it that. It's the same thing.
I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, Richard.
Oh, I remember the story I read of, was it last year? That this woman, her mother was on welfare, and she owned a house, and it's like in the South, and so after a number of years, they put a lien against her house, so that she had to pay back a certain percentage of the welfare money. And so,
when they sold the house, then they could take that from the sale of the house?
Mhm.
Yeah.
So it's something like what Chris was saying, I guess.
What Chris was saying.
Nick.
Nick,
Oh.
that's it.
All right.
How would that be a lien?
So it's kind of like a reverse mortgage is what you're talking about.
Where it's like we'll give you welfare, but there's some sense in which if you have received welfare and then you get some money, you're gonna have to like pay it back.
So it's like an asset swap. You're turning part of your house into a liquid asset, which is the money you get.
Yeah. Isn't that like
It's like reverse mortgage.
Yeah.
What about what's a home equity line of credit? Isn't that something kind of similar?
Yeah, that's borrowing against the equity of your home. That's more of a one-time thing, and you pay it back. Whereas a reverse mortgage is kind of like an ongoing. You keep getting more money out, and then the expectation is that you're not going to pay it back. But when you sell the house, you get less money from selling it.
I see.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Okay, you guys ready for the next one? So far, this has been working.
When someone's income rises, it makes lenders more willing to lend him money because now he's more worthy of credit. A credit-worthy borrower has two things: the ability to repay and collateral. Having a lot of income in relation to his debt gives him the ability to repay. In the event that he can't repay, he has valuable assets to use as collateral that can be sold. This makes lenders feel comfortable lending him money. So increased income allows increased borrowing, which allows increased spending. And since one person's spending is another person's income, this leads to more increased borrowing, and so on. This self-reinforcing pattern leads to economic growth and is why we have cycles. In a transaction, you have to give something in order to get something. And how much you get depends on how much you produce. Over time, we learn, and that accumulated knowledge raises our living standards. We call this productivity growth. Those who are inventive and hardworking raise their productivity and their living standards faster than those who are complacent and lazy. But that isn't necessarily true over the short run. Productivity matters most in the long run, but credit matters most in the short run. This is because productivity growth doesn't fluctuate much, so it's not a big driver of economic swings. Debt is, because it allows us to consume more than we produce when we acquire it, and it forces us to consume less than we produce when we have to pay it back. Debt swings occur in two big cycles. One takes about 5 to 8 years, and the other takes about 75 to 100 years. While most people feel the swings, they typically don't see them as cycles because they see them too up close, day by day, week by week. In this chapter, we're going to step back and look at these three big forces and how they interact to make up our experiences. As mentioned, swings around the line are not due to how much innovation or hard work there is. They're primarily due to how much credit there is. Let's for a second imagine an economy without credit. In this economy, the only way I can increase my spending is to increase my income, which requires me to be more productive and do more work. Increased productivity is the only way for growth. Since my spending is another person's income, the economy grows every time I or anyone else is more productive. If we follow the transactions and play this out, we see a progression like the productivity growth line. But because we borrow, we have cycles. This isn't due to any laws or regulations. It's due to human nature and the way that credit works. Think of borrowing as simply a way of pulling spending forward. In order to buy something you can't afford, you need to spend more than you make. To do this, you essentially need to borrow from your future self. In doing so, you create a time in the future that you need to spend less than you make in order to pay it back. It very quickly resembles a cycle. Basically, anytime you borrow, you create a cycle. This is as true for an individual as it is for the economy.
All right, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, my first point was just that, like, if you are seeing, one thing you pointed out at least, is that if you are seeing increased productivity over time, even without debt, wouldn't you need some additional currency of some kind being infused into the economy to kind of match that increased production?
Yes.
Which he sort of ignores, but with credit might
Right.
be one of the ways that we do that too.
Yeah.
As you talked about.
Right, that's exactly right. And this is what I was talking about at the beginning, how he's focused on the money stock.
Right.
Maybe in times when the money flow is what's relevant. So, even in an economy that's not growing, you should expect credit to be growing. Or you should expect, some other way of providing consumers with income. Or in an economy that's shrinking even, right? Because regardless of the size of the economy or whether it's growing or shrinking, consumers need a constant source of spending money in order to buy things. Because the money doesn't cycle back. Why the baby has debt.
Yeah, why? How did that happen? What's the explanation for that?
The baby represents human nature.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's not just a baby.
It's human nature to
go into debt.
to cry and borrow.
The fundamentals. Yeah.
So I think that's something I actually kind of take issue with. I don't think it's human nature to borrow too much. I think it's human nature to borrow too much if economic policy is forcing you to borrow too much.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
I also disagree with that.
Yeah.
But I don't know, now that you said that, I might have other comments. But the thing I majorly disagreed with is just that you were pointing out before that there are some, if you're treating many of these things as like things that are economically efficient, as opposed to like human nature, then there's economically efficient things about borrowing and lending, like you talked about, like time differences and when people need the money. Like they need some money to start a business now, they don't need that money as much when they've got the business, and then they can pay it back. So like, you could call that human nature, but that seems more similar to the other economic points that he's making. And yet he was kind of lumping all borrowing into, I don't really know what he meant by human nature, but that was a strange way to.
Well, I don't think he's explained it yet. I think he's going to say that
Yeah.
Oh, did you watch that?
there's a no, but
You're just optimistic.
It seemed to me like he was leading up to something.
Yeah, maybe he is.
Like
You're
he's
right.
going to say,
Yeah, maybe he'll tell us.
we're naturally, our eyes are bigger than our stomachs or something.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
Or
I mean, I think he is saying that, but I think he's also saying that some amount of credit is important, that people do need to, like, credit is important for the economy. When he's just talking about the straight productivity growth line and, an economy without credit, that actually does seem pretty good, right? That seems like a pretty good baseline. Like you're.
Except that, again, you might not be able to grow without some credit for like founding
Right.
businesses that are based on the idea.
But
that
you can have an economy not with no credit, but with enough credit that people can borrow in order to fund reasonable business ventures, but not with so much credit that you have this credit cycle of ever expanding credit. You know what I mean? Like that's possible.
Be really productive, it seems. That was his other.
That was when he was specifically talking about the productivity. Yeah. But I mean, like.
I'm not even in agreement necessarily with them. The more productive somebody is, the higher the
Income.
spending, the higher the income.
Well,
it depends on the job.
Well, the idea, he's talking about productivity in terms of like how much stuff you're producing and selling to other people. So if you're producing more, you're getting more money coming in, which means you can spend more. That's the sense in which he's talking about it.
Yeah,
I know.
You can certainly tell who the poor cartoon was in
Yeah.
He had poor posture and he wouldn't put a single sphere in a single box.
Yeah, no spheres.
So something that he does keep saying over and over again is that credit creates cycles. And I don't think this is inherently true. I think if you're trying to compensate
for consumers not having enough income using the financial sector, then that causes unstable credit growth, and that causes cycles. You're not going to
say it again. If you're trying to compensate,
so consumers need spending money in order to be able to buy things.
right?
If you're the Federal Reserve and consumers are not getting enough spending money from other sources, then what you're going to do is you're going to stimulate the financial sector, and that creates unstable credit growth. And that kind of thing leads to the cycles that Ray Dalio is talking about. If you have a basic income that's at a high enough level, you can keep credit down to a sustainable level that merely greases the wheels of useful investment. And I think that's something that's true. This is not like fundamental to human nature. It's not fundamental to credit. It's not fundamental to how the economy works. I mean, it's something that's been happening,
Right.
but it's also like he shows this regular thing. It's not a regular thing. You know, economists argue all the time about, oh, like when's the next recession? You're
Right,
like,
yeah.
you know, it's not like, it's like, oh, it's just, you know, like how many days do we have left or something like that, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, he might not have really explained what he means by human nature, but I guess I was just thinking in terms of the eyes bigger than the stomach argument, like couldn't you just set the interest rate high enough that wouldn't be the case? Like people also care that they don't want to pay back like, some huge amount of money later. That's also part of human nature.
Yeah.
So, you know, it would seem like interest rates would have to be appropriate for, like, if you're worried about people just wanting to always, like, borrow as much as they can. Doesn't creditworthiness and interest rate already take care of that kind of?
Yeah, but the Fed keeps interest rates low. That's how they stimulate the financial sector. So,
Right.
so if the basic income is higher, that allows the Fed to raise interest rates, or to so that all the private lenders in the financial sector are kind of in general raising interest rates higher.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So Derek says, and this is a good point, he also suggests at the beginning that the upwards climb of the debt cycle represents us consuming more than we produce, which doesn't make sense. It could make sense if you are an individual person borrowing in order to spend money because you can't you can't sell your services because no one wants to buy them, so you borrow in order to spend. Now you as an individual person are consuming more than you produce, but it's not really possible for the entire economy to be consuming more than it produces unless you're imagining that
They're borrowing from like China or something.
Unless you're imagining that there are times when the economy is producing a lot of extra stuff and like storing up inventories, and then when everyone's borrowing, it's like drawing down its inventories or something like that.
Really
That's not what's happening. No. Generally speaking, that borrowing is funding, is purchasing production. It's purchase. You know, like it's not just drawing down inventories, right?
Yeah.
It's just that different people are doing the producing and the consuming. The consumers have to borrow, and the producers are the ones producing and taking as income a lot of that borrowed money, right? So that's the issue. It's not that the economy as a whole is consuming more than it produces.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And the flip side too, like we usually aren't like producing more than we're consuming when we have the recession. Like we're not usually just like putting stuff in inventories. We're producing under our capacity, but
we're producing less. Yes.
We stop producing the stuff. Right.
That's right, and that's part of like what the definition of a recession is that the economy starts producing less. And it's not going to produce less if people still have money to spend. Like in the 1930s, we had more productive capacity than we had in the 1920s, yet we were producing less. It was because people didn't have the money to activate the production.
And I think this is really important in terms of like sometimes the confusion that can come, at least for me, trying to look at an individual and then trying to like scale it up to the whole economy, because maybe that could be true for an individual, but it can't really be true for the whole economy. So you're clearly missing some aspect of the picture that's important.
Right.
There, I think. Yeah.
So Eddie says, I think Dalio's main point is basically that there are cycles. And I think that's a good point that he's making, and there are cycles. There don't have to be. This is not something that's fundamental to the economy. And he's kind of framing it as if it is. And he's kind of talking about it as if like, I have this thing figured out, and if you figure it out too, then that'll be good for you or something like that. But no, he's figured out something about the way we've currently set up the system without a basic income. Times when you're above the curve, when credit expands, and times when you're below, when credit decreases and people are fearful. So yeah, those are the cycles. And then Eddie says, I actually think Soros's reflexivity could explain cycles even in the absence of credit. So I'm assuming he's referring to George Soros. I don't know what that concept is, Soros's reflexivity. And Derek says the problem is that Dalio seems to frame the upward climb as somehow unsustainable relative to productivity, so it has to eventually rebalance. And yeah, I mean, like, I think the credit bubble is unsustainable. Like when the credit is building on itself and becoming more unstable. But increased spending does not have to be unstable. Our economy can look a lot like the kind of straight up productivity growth curve that Ray Dalio drew. He assumes that productivity growth is this regular kind of straight up line. I wouldn't assume that necessarily. You could have some innovation come along and it spurts up, or like I would not assume that it's a stable regular thing.
There's no reason it would be.
There's no reason it would be, but a lot of economists assume that it kind of naturally is stable, or that GDP growth has this kind of natural rate of 2%, 4% or something like that.
It's hard to predict when it's going to spurt up versus you just kind of smooth over that.
Yeah, and they also observe historically what has happened with GDP is that it's kind of been pretty regular in terms of its growth and that kind of thing, except during recessions. But the problem is that GDP growth is largely dependent on economic policy, right? It depends on, like the economy is not going to grow to its full capacity. It's going to grow based on, well, how much money are people spending? Are we, keeping the purchasing power of the currency at the same level? Then there are constraints on how much the economy can grow. But we don't know what it would look like if we didn't have those constraints. Eddie's, the reflexivity is just buying begets good feelings begets more buying, basically. I think that's true, but I also think you can compensate for that stuff with monetary policy. So if people are spending too much money in kind of a way that's leading toward inflation or something like that, then you can tighten monetary policy. Maybe you don't increase the basic income that year, that kind of thing. There's ways to push back against market sentiment. And I would say that by and large, the big central banks have gotten really good at keeping the purchasing power of their currencies stable. They still have these, credit cycles and recessions and booms and stuff like that. But generally speaking, like the dollar was fine throughout 2008 and all of that. The euro is fine. Like the currencies are doing fine. And I feel like, if central banks, if that's all they're focused on and that's all we care about them doing, they're doing great. They're doing a great job. Eddie says he thinks Dalio's framework is kind of more diagnostic. You can look at where you are in the cycle than it is theoretical, because when people are over leveraged, borrowing too much, it makes it easier for them to get scared. So I think that's true to some extent, but again, it's really, really hard to predict recessions, and a lot of it depends on politics, a lot of it depends on policies. Where are we in the cycle right now? I don't know. I'll tell you in 10 years, right? There's no it's very hard to diagnose a recession until well after the fact, and all of this kind of stuff. It's not just a machine that you can look at and diagnose where we are and what needs to happen next. People do make guesses. Sometimes they're educated guesses. Sometimes they get lucky, and that's great. But you have to be able to, if you really want to predict this stuff, you have to be able to predict unexpected events that might trigger a collapse. You have to predict government policies that might change politics. So you have to predict market sentiment and just how people are feeling. Like buying begets good feelings. All of that stuff. Yeah. Okay. Anyone have any comments before the next clip? We're gonna skip ahead a little bit here. Oh, I gotta make sure our live streamers can watch.
In an economy with credit, we can follow the transactions and see how credit creates growth. Let me give you an example. Suppose you earn $100,000 a year and have no debt. You are creditworthy enough to borrow $10,000, say on a credit card. So you can spend $110,000 even though you only earn $100,000. Since your spending is another person's income, someone is earning $110,000. The person earning $110,000 with no debt can borrow $11,000, so he can spend $121,000, even though he has only earned $110,000. His spending is another person's income, and by following the transactions, we can begin to see how this process works in a self-reinforcing pattern. But remember, Borrowing creates cycles, and if the cycle goes up, it eventually needs to come down. This leads us into the short-term debt cycle. As economic activity increases, we see an expansion, the first phase of the short-term debt cycle. Spending continues to increase and prices start to rise. This happens because the increase in spending is fueled by credit, which can be created instantly out of thin air. When the amount of spending and incomes grow faster than the production of goods, prices rise. When prices rise, we call this inflation. The central bank doesn't want too much inflation because it causes problems. Seeing prices rise, it raises interest rates. With higher interest rates, fewer people can afford to borrow money, and the cost of existing debts rises. Think about this as the monthly payments on your credit card going up. Because people borrow less and have higher debt repayments, they have less money left over to spend, so spending slows. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes drop, and so on and so forth. When people spend less, prices go down. We call this deflation. Economic activity decreases, and we have a recession. If the recession becomes too severe and inflation is no longer a problem, the central bank will lower interest rates to cause everything to pick up again. With low interest rates, debt repayments are reduced and borrowing and spending pick up, and we see another expansion. As you can see, the economy works like a machine. In the short-term debt cycle, spending is constrained only by the willingness of lenders and borrowers to provide and receive credit. When credit is easily available, there's an economic expansion. When credit isn't easily available, there's a recession. And note that this cycle is controlled primarily by the central bank. The short-term debt cycle typically lasts 5 to 8 years and happens over and over again for decades.
Yeah.
Does he get to like the crash dynamics? Because his current dynamics are kind of both
He
gradual.
does get to the crash dynamics when he talks about what he calls the long-term debt cycle. But this is still interesting because he talks about the Fed controlling the short-term debt cycle, and it certainly is true that things go one way and then they push back, and then they go the other way and they push back the other way. I don't know. I guess everything I said before.
Well, which things do you feel are relevant to that? Just this idea that it could be more sustainable or something like that?
I mean, the idea that these cycles are just kind of a natural, like he talks about the economy being a machine. These cycles are a natural part of the economy. It can only ever be this way.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I mean, his example of like any kind of borrowing leads to a cycle at the level of an individual is, I mean, that's obviously wrong, right? Like if you have no job and then you borrow money so you can buy a car, and that lets you get to your job, and then you have no trouble paying back your loan. That doesn't mean you have to like cut back later. You have more money later.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
actually talks
Even
about
after
that.
you pay back the car, right?
I agree. Yeah.
Well, compared to if you had just had the money originally and not had to have paid anything back or something.
But there's
like
no
that.
cycle. There's no
There's no
point
cycle.
in that story where you're like, well, now I have to
Yeah.
like go back to, and I'm
Which
going
I
to be
think is
even
actually-
poorer than I was
which
before
is
because
super-
now I'm paying it all
Right.
back.
It's super
Yeah.
important, I think, that point, because those are the times that people are gonna really want to borrow because it makes sense. Like they want to start a business or they want to like get a job or whatever. Usually they want to borrow when it's going to make us more profitable in the future, not when it's just for now and then we're just going to have to pay back.
I mean,
Unless we're
usually,
desperate.
if you're desperate, yeah.
Well, yeah, but I guess that's your point about like healthy. It seems like these like healthy forms of borrowing that Alex is talking about or you're talking about are kind of left out of this idea.
And the cycle dynamic, you're right, it doesn't happen at the level of an individual person. It only happens at the level of the economy.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm confused about how it's related to inflation and deflation. I mean,
Right.
he seems to be combining those two concepts, and I'm not clear about one overtaking another. I mean, does one cause another?
So that's a really good point. His thinking, the way he's thinking about it, is that the increased credit
leads to increased spending, and then you have more money kind of chasing the same number of goods or something like that, and then you have inflation.
Right.
In real life, there's not that much inflation during a boom, and there's not that much deflation. Like it's the central bank, it keeps that pretty well in check. Like inflation wasn't that different during the 2008, 2009 period than it was during the period before, the period after, right?
How's it related to credit and spending?
So, well, the idea is that if there's more money flowing, then prices will go up because people will be spending more money.
Credit card.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the idea, but I think a big thing that Ray Dalio is missing is what I was talking about before, that consumers need a continuous flow of money just to keep prices where they are, to keep the economy producing at normal levels. So you'll have these credit bubbles even without any inflation or deflation, on the way up or the way down, that kind of thing. Yeah.
It seems to miss the idea that also like you could have more production rise to meet.
Yeah.
He's
Right.
kind of leaving that out, like that he's assuming that production is the same level, and then you're just spending more money on competition.
Yeah, it was
Right.
really confusing because I thought initially when he was like prices, I was like, oh right, like the amount of money people spend versus the stuff that they actually buy.
Yeah, exactly.
And then his inflation, deflation, I was like, oh wait, you're just assuming like a set amount of goods that exist. And so like, if people have spent $2 million, and there's 1 million goods, then like, oh, the price is $2 per good. And then if people like spend less than now the price is only like $1 per good. I'm like, but it's only the goods that people buy. You can't be like, well, nobody bought like tractor. It's like you can't calculate prices for tractors if no one bought them.
But I think what he's trying to say is that even if the central bank is almost perfectly controlling inflation, it's a hard job because it's hard to predict. I mean, he's sort of saying like, even if you had no credit, productivity would gradually increase. But part of the benefit of credit is that it lets increase faster.
Right.
But you don't know how much faster it's going to increase exactly, and it's contingent on just technology, and so it's a hard job. So it's not a surprise maybe that they put a little too much credit in, and that leads to the cycle.
I think it's weird because it's often described, monetary policy, it's often described as like you're on this knife's edge and you don't want to overheat the economy, but you don't want to like send it into recession, and it's this delicate balance, that kind of thing. I think the truth is that they're always both overstimulating and understimulating the economy at the same time. The problem is that the stimulus is coming through credit expansion, right? So people aren't getting enough money to spend to buy the economy's full output. At the same time, you get these unstable credit bubbles forming that eventually have to collapse.
Right. But I mean, given their way of stimulating it,
Yeah.
that's how they're stimulating the economy, then this description seems pretty, I mean, it's simplified, but it holds together, I think.
I think that's right. And I don't think I would say that they're ever really overstimulating the economy. I would just say that by the fact that the economy is riding a credit bubble just to sustain itself, it's going to collapse eventually, right? That's not a mistake that the Fed made or something like that, right?
Isn't it also true that like to the degree that production isn't rising to meet the increased credit, nobody's actually getting to like get any more stuff that they want from borrowing?
So there's the increased quantity of credit, like the credit stock, and then there's the increased flow of spending. If the production doesn't rise to meet increased flow of spending, that's when you'd actually get inflation.
Like I'm talking about his explanation, where he thinks it leads to inflation. So if it leads to inflation, you're not actually getting to spend your extra income on anything useful.
I think the idea, and this is common in economics and macroeconomics, is that people think of the economy as booming, and that kind of goes along with inflation. Obviously, it was a little bit different in the 1970s, but the idea is that there's extra money flowing and that stimulates things. So there's growth in production, but it doesn't quite keep up with the growth of money.
Like extra.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So then you have a booming economy, but also inflation at the same time. Yeah.
That's helpful.
Doesn't Dalio's formula explain the 2008 housing bubble? That there was an easy mortgage credit and this caused housing to prices to inflate beyond all reason.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's basically right. I think, I guess the difference between me and him is that I would say that that didn't have to happen. That if we had had a basic income, we wouldn't have had to keep credit so easy, that it would cause that kind of collapse. And even if you do have a collapse in credit, if people have a basic income, maybe some of their extra spending power that they had from the financial sector is gone, but they still have the basic income. So then you don't have to worry too much about the productive economy collapsing all the way because everyone still has money to spend. Yeah.
Okay. Well, concerning that, I'm getting back to baby human nature.
Yeah.
Seems like Dalio would say that even with a basic income, baby human nature would get carried away and get as much credit as human nature, as much credit as they could legally get away with.
Yeah.
So that's the baby human nature view. I don't actually really agree with that, and you don't really agree with that. For instance, people don't go to payday lenders because their eyes are bigger than their stomach, or they're suddenly wearing rose-colored glasses. They go there out of desperation.
Right.
And maybe people who can only get a subprime mortgage didn't do that because they thought this was a really clever move to put one over on Wall Street or something, but because it was the only way they could buy a house.
Yeah, and I think it's also true that even if to some extent people's eyes are bigger than their stomachs, all that means is that you have to raise interest rates a little higher. Yeah, you just have to compensate for that, and then it's fine. Yeah.
The eye stomach.
Yeah, you gotta exactly right. Right. So there's a few more comments on here. Eddie says, the thing is, although there's no theoretical limit to debt, in reality, there's always a limit. The reality being the lender's willingness to lend. I think that's true. Yep. You can't, when a lot of times when they talk about stimulating the financial sector, you can't force a lender to lend money. They talk about pushing on a string, how, like you can give them some slack and let them go if that's where they want to go. Imagine a dog and you can let it go ahead, but if it doesn't want to go forward, you don't, push on the leash and expect anything to happen. So that's true. I think it is true, though, that if you tighten monetary policy, that does rein it in. If the dog does want to run forward, you can hold it back. So you don't have to worry. I guess there's less of a need to use monetary stimulus to fund the normal economy, and if you have a basic income, so you don't really need to push on the string in the first place. People can borrow when they have a business that's worth investing in or something like that. And then Eddie says, with government debt, although they can print unlimited currency in theory, in reality at some point, people begin losing faith in the currency, leading potentially to hyperinflation. I don't know about that. I think you get hyperinflation when the government is trying to spend more money than the economy can productively respond to. It's less about kind of the amount of money in existence, and it's more about the level of spending that the government is doing. So if, for example, let's say you just lost World War I, and you need to pay a certain amount of reparations to France and all your other neighbors, and that has to be in French francs or gold. So you have to your economy can only produce, you just lost a war, your economy can only produce a certain amount of stuff that actually has value in French francs and gold, yet you have this obligation, so you're forced to do something, to make it look like you're doing something to pay your reparations, to pay your war reparations, right? So what you do is you print a bunch of money to access the resources that are available in your economy is maxed out, tapped out, but you still have to keep spending more because you have this obligation that you have to fulfill. You don't have a choice, right? So it's less about the kind of just the amount of money that Germany printed after World War I, and it's more about the fact that they had to keep printing money. They had to keep going above and beyond what the economy could handle, and they didn't have a choice. Yeah, and a similar thing in Zimbabwe, except they did have a choice, and they really just wanted to fund a civil war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and they wanted to kick all the farmers off their land and replace them with less productive farmers because of social things. So, but I mean, like, hyperinflation isn't just about printing money, and eventually it's too much money. It's about the level of spending getting to be too high.
Relative to like what you can produce.
Relative to what the economy can handle, yeah. So a great example, we can even use a basic income example, right? So let's say the economy can produce, one banana for everyone. That's what our economy can produce. And someone comes along and says, well, everybody should be entitled to 2 bananas. So we're going to index the basic income to whatever amount will buy 2 bananas, no matter what. That's when you get hyperinflation. Does that make sense? Because you can never buy two bananas, so it just keeps going up and up and up. Yeah.
Unless people don't like bananas.
Yeah.
Or you just start like murdering your neighbors.
Yeah, half the people.
So I don't think it's true that the credit card gets maxed. I think there's a limit to how much spending you can do in a period of time, but if you keep going into the future, there's not really a constraint there. And it's useful to think about where money goes in the economy because it doesn't just keep circulating. So it's useful to think about where the money comes from and then where it ends up. And the kind of oversimplified way of thinking about it is that it starts with consumers and then it flows to consumers. So goods and services flow to consumers and money flows away from consumers. And that's kind of something that's always happening. So the producers are then accumulating money, which then they transform into other financial assets like government debt, that kind of thing. And the government will provide that for people, as part of their monetary policy. People don't want to hold cash. Money is the thing you spend and not the thing you save. So they'll transform that cash into other forms of financial assets. Then people are happy to accumulate. But when you think about how much money someone has, you're thinking about like kind of what their wealth is. People spend money not based on how many nickels and quarters they have. They spend money based on how wealthy they are, right? So Jeff Bezos when we say Jeff Bezos has a lot of money, it doesn't mean he has stacks of dollar bills. So there are financial assets that are like money that people are happy to accumulate, and that's what ends up happening. So the money accumulates perpetually, and then it flows through the productive economy perpetually. And and it doesn't just automatically cycle back to consumers. There's no mechanism that makes 100% of that money recycle back to consumers. Some people assume that the labor market, just keeps all the money cycling, and it keeps some of the money cycling. Some of the money cycles back to consumers, but it can't ever be all of it. So we have to make up that difference. And we can make up that difference through basic income, or we can make up that difference through, overstimulating the financial sector. And the second thing is what we're doing now. And that's what leads to the business cycle and the credit cycle. Yeah. More video. We want to see more video. Where's Ray Dalio going? It's only a 30-minute video.
Oh, it's 30 minutes.
Yeah. We probably won't get to all of it, so let's look at the next one though. We have enough time for 2 more.
Is the long-term debt peak. Debt burdens have simply become too big. For the United States, Europe, and much of the rest of the world, this happened in 2008. It happened for the same reason it happened in Japan in 1989 and in the United States back in 1929. Now the economy begins deleveraging. In a deleveraging, people cut spending, incomes fall, credit disappears, asset prices drop, banks get squeezed, the stock market crashes, social tensions rise, and the whole thing starts to feed on itself the other way. As incomes fall and debt repayments rise, borrowers get squeezed. No longer creditworthy, Credit dries up, and borrowers can no longer borrow enough money to make their debt repayments. Scrambling to fill this hole, borrowers are forced to sell assets. The rush to sell assets floods the market at the same time as spending falls. This is when the stock market collapses, the real estate market tanks, and banks get into trouble. As asset prices drop, the value of the collateral borrowers can put up drops. This makes borrowers even less creditworthy. People feel poor. Credit rapidly disappears. Less spending, less income, less wealth, less credit, less borrowing, and so on. It's a vicious cycle. This appears similar to a recession, but the difference here is that interest rates can't be lowered to save the day. In a recession, lowering interest rates works to stimulate borrowing. However, in a deleveraging, lowering interest rates doesn't work because interest rates are already low and soon hit 0%, so the stimulation ends. Interest rates in the United States hit 0% during the deleveraging of the 1930s and again in 2008. The difference between a recession and a deleveraging is that in a deleveraging, borrowers' debt burdens have simply gotten too big and can't be relieved by lowering interest rates. Lenders realize that debts have become too large to ever be fully paid back. Borrowers have lost their ability to repay and their collateral has lost value. They feel crippled by the debt. They don't even want more. Lenders stop lending, borrowers stop borrowing. Think of the economy as being not creditworthy, just like an individual.
Okay. So I think I probably wouldn't draw such a dramatic distinction between, what he was talking about before with recessions and then this kind of like more extreme deleveraging. I think, when the central bank's interest rates hit zero, there are still other things they can do to stimulate the financial sector, and we actually saw that in the wake of 2008. That they started buying up other different types of assets to make sure that the money markets were still able to function properly and that kind of thing. There's other things they can do. It's just they hadn't tried some of those other things yet. Yeah. Yeah, and this is kind of like an ongoing thing. Like they keep. Everybody keeps thinking they have an answer to the business cycle and the credit cycle, and that it can be solved through monetary policy or mitigated or something like that. I think you no matter what we do with monetary policy, there are things we can do to kind of lengthen out the time between recessions, and to if there are things you can do that don't look like printing money, they look more like monetary policy, but maybe it really is more like printing money behind the scenes. So for example, in the Great Depression, the government decided to insure all of the banks. So now, private bank money, it's a lot like government money because it's insured. So they kind of printed money, through this kind of insurance and this promise, right? So they're always figuring out ways to do stuff like that. Yes, because to the extent that it actually is printing new money or functions in that way, you're doing something that's more like a basic income, more like a fiscal stimulus.
Is it just like backstopping the crash? Doesn't slowing the crash also help in its own way?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. You don't want the financial markets to collapse altogether. Rob?
I guess, question, do you think the only way to avoid these cycles is just to live in a creditless world? Because I know you said monetary policy, and they have other gimmicks like TARP, et cetera, but is the only true way to avoid it 100% just
No.
have creditless society?
No, not at all. And I would say that that we don't necessarily need to regulate credit at all, credit creation at all. The answer for me would be to bring the basic income up to a high enough level that the Fed doesn't feel like it needs to prop up consumer spending by stimulating the financial sector.
So substitute credit for basic income, essentially?
Exactly. So that allows the Fed to tighten, and then if you set the basic income high enough, you can get the financial sector to act more in this way that the only lending and borrowing that's really happening is more geared toward actual productive real investments and business growth and stuff like that.
Sure, because the basic needs are taken care of already by the...
Yeah, and by basic needs, it's just that consumers need spending money in order for the market economy to function.
Okay.
So you kind of want to calibrate the basic income to the level that allows us to collectively activate the economy's full productive capacity.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I thought Eddie kind of made a point
yeah.
on the in the comments that made me want to ask what your take is on it, Alex. That you know, spending so much that you get, that you exceed the supply, the productive capacity of the economy could give you inflation, but then another limit would be people losing faith in the currency, right? So if China decided that they, saving lots of dollars was no longer seemed like a good idea, and stopped being willing to save dollars and send, so many, like a big part of the productive capacity that we access
Is what
in
we
our
can import.
economy is what is manufactured overseas. And if people stop being happy to sell us those goods for dollars, then that would, so I guess my question is is there a risk that the government spending a lot on basic income would lead to them changing that, losing confidence in
Yeah, I
the
mean,
dollar?
yes. So if we're spending more money on imports and we just keep sending China money and they keep sending us stuff, over time they might be like, well, wait a minute, we're going to start raising our prices on these things, that kind of thing. I don't imagine that it would be something that would happen all at once. So, it would be something that we could gradually respond to. And as you say, the capacity to import from foreign countries is part of our capacity to provide things for consumers. So as you're calibrating the basic income and gradually increasing it, if people want to export to us less, that creates various pressures and market incentives. Maybe there's more incentive to produce more domestically. Certainly, when people talk about using tariffs to protect American jobs, that feels, if China wants to keep giving us cheap, free stuff for forever, that seems fine. But we do have, resources domestic resources available that we can activate if China wants to sell us less. So it's more of a gradual thing. But yeah, for sure,
That
definitely.
would constrain how high the basic income could go.
Right.
If China was responding that way, it is in a sense a hit to our productive capacity.
That's right.
We're able to afford that stuff, right? So we definitely will raise it less quickly or
Yeah.
But that's also kind of an advantage to your approach of gradual increase. Because you can imagine it would be more difficult if you just set an amount and that amount was really high and then China responded and then it might be more jerky of a situation in terms of quicker changes.
Yeah. So let's get people's final thoughts. We're at the end here. There's more to the video. I encourage everyone to watch the full video. It's pretty good. Obviously, I don't agree with all of it, and if you watch the rest of it, in the context of having had this discussion, you'll be able to think about it, the way we've been thinking about it. He talks about at the end. He talks more about the central bank as the one who can print money, and he talks about the central bank and the central government cooperating to provide fiscal stimulus, which is more of the kind of thing that I talk about. He would more advocate that in kind of recovering from a recession, having a smoother transition, after deleveraging, that kind of thing. Whereas I would say it makes sense for it to be an ongoing policy so that we never have the credit cycle in the first place.
What does he say would make a smoother transition?
If during the deleveraging, the government uses fiscal stimulus that's funded by the central bank lending. Yeah.
Because he's thinking the interest rate lever is not working enough.
Right. That's right. Yep.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. Bethany.
I'll have to watch the rest of the video. It was interesting to try to see the economy through his lens.
Yeah.
My dream is that people get a little more money from UBI and they don't have to pursue credit as much, and that this would allow regular people to not get tangled up with Wall Street as much. So that even if Wall Street has to do its casino thing and crash, you won't take the normal people down. Good.
This is a really good overview for me. Learn. Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting discussion.
Cool.
Yeah. Something I don't think.
Yeah. I guess two thoughts is one is I think of like Bitcoin with like a finite amount of like whatever it is, like 21 million or something like that, and so like a fixed money pool, if you will, kind of going back to the currency discussion, and taking that power away from any one government. And then two, I also wonder what you just said as far as substituting credit for UBI, if that could somehow trigger like a moving target where people will burn through their UBI and it's like, well, I still need more, so now I'm going to hit the credit. And it's just kind of like a rising tide raises all ships. It just moves the target a little bit.
Yeah. Richard?
Well, in the video it said that the entire economy is based on $3 trillion. Could that $3 trillion like disappear through like the stock market crashing or something like that?
There's lots of ways for money to disappear. It's just people hoarding it, and it's not going through the productive economy anymore. Yeah. To Robert's point, what was the second thing you said?
So like substituting credit for UBI, if it kind of just
right.
shifts the burden like temporarily where they go through their UBI and then it's like, well, I still need credit now.
So I think from an individual perspective, people might respond in that way.
Yeah.
But from a regulatory perspective, from a monetary policy perspective, I don't think it would be the case that the Fed would feel obliged to prop up consumer spending in that way anymore. Like they would feel comfortable tightening, and then if people are, not able to, spend their money responsibly, that's kind of like a personal problem that they have, and you could just let them have that problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. Great discussion, everyone. Thanks for everyone on the live stream. This was fun. I'm glad that our video worked out. Next week we're talking about organized labor. So that should also be an interesting one. Slightly different discussion, but also relevant. Okay, thanks guys.
Thanks.
Thanks.